Hello and welcome to 3ds Max 101, Week 4, with your lead instructor, Mark Gerhard.
Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be covering the materials part of Max. If you look at the outline, we're actually only up to Week 3. Week 1 and the first sections got stretched a little longer than we expected. So today we'll be looking at materials. Hope everyone can see my screen, and I've got a simple model of a P-38 fighter plane here, and I'm going to use this as a demonstration to show off some of the things about materials. So materials are really one of the most important parts of Max. Materials are the way that you put color and texture and basically paint the surfaces of your objects. Okay, so the material, so far, what you have seen is that we can add a color by clicking on the name and color, the color swatch right there. If I move my mouse around, you'll see the color swatch right there, and that this is using an object color. And I just want to make sure that you know that you can actually simply use these in more primitive kinds of animations and models. You don't necessarily have to use materials. This is the first way that you can add colors to your objects. And you can choose between the 3ds Max palette or the AutoCAD ACI palette. The AutoCAD ACI palette has colors that match the colors that come out of AutoCAD engineering files. There are 256 colors here. It comes from 8-bit. This is ancient technology. Whether you choose this one or that one, you also have custom colors over here, and you can choose add custom colors. And why is that happening way up there? Let's just try this again. Cancel. And now we will add custom colors. There we go. And so this is the color selector for custom colors. And this color selector, just so you know, because you use this frequently throughout the program, basically you have a number of different ways that you can mix colors here. The simplest way is to choose colors on this rainbow-hued large square on the left, which essentially you can notice that as I move this around, that on the right-hand side, all of the other parts are going crazy. So if I say, okay, I would like, I'll just set it down right there, then I can add blackness into it. I can add whiteness into it, or I can switch the hue up here. So if you have an art background, this might be the simplest way to think of it. If you have a more computer background, then you might instead think in terms of RGB. So a pure RGB value here, 255 blue, 00 red and green, will give you a pure blue. Notice that that puts this value all the way up to the top with no blackness and no whiteness attached. You could change the hue slider here, which would be the same as changing it here. And then you could also add saturation is the same as adding whiteness, and value is the same as adding blackness. And I'm going to say that once you understand how to do that, you can click Add Color, and that'll add colors into the custom color palette here for you to change. The other thing that I want you to know about is that there's a button here that's marked Assign Random Colors. And when this is checked, then as you make objects in the Max scene, random colors are assigned here. through this. So if you want to avoid this, you can turn this off, and then as you make objects, they will all be the same color. There's also a select by color, so that you can actually, if you have a particular thing, you can go select by color and it will select the objects. It'll bring up the select object dialog box and show you all of the objects in the scene that have that object color. The last thing before I jump into materials is that if I come over here to the display panel, you'll notice that display color has two options here, that you can have the wireframe choose to be by this object color or by the material color. You can also have the shading of the object be by the object color or material color. So sometimes if you apply materials to an object and it doesn't show up, it's because this is chosen like that. And alternately, when you're wanting to demonstrate to someone something, you might want to change the object color, the wireframe, to an object color. Okay, so back to basics. The materials are a step above all of this, and we find the materials in the material editor. Material editor can be found by going to the rendering dialog, the rendering menu on the menu bar, coming down to material editor. And there are two material editors that are available. The original material editor is called the compact material editor, and recently they added the slate material editor. I'm going to start with the compact material editor. I'm more comfortable with the compact material editor, having it's been my friend or nemesis for so long, for the past 15 years. So this is what the material editor looks like. I'm going to give you a quick tour of the interface of this material editor so that you can understand it, and then I'm going to dive into how materials generally work. Material editor has a menu bar at the top. This menu bar is actually a recent addition to this material editor. Beyond that, it has sample spheres or sample slots here, and those sample slots can be cycled. With the X on the keyboard is the shortcut. So I'll go here. We can now see a total of 64 sample slots. Oftentimes, when you open up this material editor, it looks like that. But there are the ability to still see the 64 sample slots by using the scroll bars, horizontal scroll bar here, vertical scroll bar over here. I can also place my mouse cursor in the middle on any of these lines, and that will also allow me to move in this fashion. Beyond that, there's a vertical toolbar on the side and a horizontal toolbar underneath, and these toolbars have a similar tool flyouts. If you see a little black corner, that shows you that by pressing down, you'll find that there are alternative tools hiding there for you to explore. In addition to that, there is some information here about reflectance and transmittance. And then on the line below it, we have the a set of icons here. It's actually a good idea to go through and read each of these as you explore the material editor, just to discover where everything is. Now under that, there's a eyedropper for picking materials. So let's go ahead and demonstrate. If I choose one of these sample spheres, and then I click on the eyedropper and come over here and I click, I will see here, let's see, there's no material on any of these objects yet, so we're in good shape. Well, I'm going to actually take this moment to go onto the utilities and reset the material sample spheres. And now I will see one issue that is something that can be bothersome, which is that depending on what renderer you have chosen, that renderer will be used for the material editor. And then there may be a conflict between the materials, the default materials, and the renderer. So in this case, because I have Design Viz, because I have Design Viz defaults set up here, then we're having an issue because the renderer isn't set. Let's just put this down for 1 second and go and look and see what the renderer is. I'll go to Renderer Setup, and you can see that I have the scanline renderer chosen. So if I come to Assign Renderer here and I change the renderer to Mental Ray Renderer, then all those spheres will look pleasant. Now I noticed some witty comment about this in comparison to Maya. There, he said it, Maya. I just will point out that this is what the more recent material editor, the Slate material editor, looks like. Give it a moment to load. And actually, this looks more like Modo than anything that I can think of. And if I choose over here, this will give me a, let's see, I do know a little bit about using this thing. Oh, it's so horrible. There, you want a hypershade? You got a hypershade. So anyway, and I can zoom into pieces here, and I can see how everything is done here. Hang on 1 second. Okay, so this is what we'll come back to look at this. There are some times when I do go in and use the Slate material editor, but for the most part, because I am an old guy who knows it, I'm content with my other editor. So you may skip this editor entirely if you desire. It's up to you. Okay, so let's go over and let's explain some of the basics here, which is if I choose a sample slot, and then I come over here in the corner, and by clicking on that button there, this gives me the various options for the kinds of materials that I could create. And if I go under Materials and I choose Standard here, these are all the standard materials that I could create. I make Standard here, and this turns yellow there to show you I've selected it, and go like that. And now you see this is appearing as a material. Quickly, I'm going to copy some of these over here, just because as an artist, those little black things are driving me crazy. Okay, that looks better to me now. So let's start with this. Now, this material is active. That material slot is active. Let's give this a name. I'm going to call this P38 wing, and then I have a name for it. Now, the first thing that you need to understand about the Max material structure is that I don't know who thought this was a good idea, but the way it's set up is so that materials can exist independently in a number of different places. So right now, this material, P38 wing, is existing only in the material editor. It does not exist in the scene itself. If I take that material and I drag it onto the wing, now it does exist both in the scene and in the material editor. I can tell that, let's get out of shaded mode. Let's get out of edged face mode for a second so that you can see it. So this material now exists here and here. And there are these little corners that have been applied to tell you that. If I double click on this, I get a larger view of it, but the double corners aren't visible there. I can drag this out as large as I want. Now, this material is a standard material. We've called it P38 wing, and it's been applied to this object here. Because it's a standard material, it has certain parameters. And all of these parameters are related to a standard material. If I were to choose a different kind of material, either a standard material or another type of material, we don't see mental ray materials in this list right now. As soon as I chose mental ray as the renderer, then this list would become populated with mental ray materials. If I had V-ray, this would become populated with all the different kinds of V-ray materials that I could choose. This is called the material map browser right here, and it looks like it's having a little issue. Let's hope Max doesn't crash. Sometimes when you see the interface start to go away, it means that Max is running out of memory. And let me just make sure that I've got everything closed that could possibly be closed here. Close that, and let's go ahead and close Mozilla. All right, that may help a little bit. Okay, so now back to this. So what I want to show you is, in this case, we are using a shader, and the shader options that we have for the standard materials include Blinn, metal, multi-layer, Oren-Nayer Blinn, Phong, Strauss, a translucent shader, and anisotropic. He can pronounce anisotropic. We'll leave it with, we'll start with Blinn. Blinn is for Jim Blinn. Jim Blinn is a famous 3D graphics guy. I think he's mostly famous for having long hair and a beard. He made it okay for 3D graphics guys to look weird. So anyway, these shaders are all named for various mathematicians. And I don't know if I've mentioned that in my world, I went to art school, so I believe that all of this CG is where the frontiers of science meet the backwaters of art. Okay, so Blinn shader gives you certain Blinn basic parameters. So the shader basic parameters are here, and if I choose a different one, you'll see now it's anisotropic basic parameters. If I choose metal, we have different parameters. I'm going to run through the Blinn parameters so that you get an idea of what's what. If I want to change the color of this, I come down here and I see there are three different choices: ambient, diffuse, and specular. If I click on the diffuse color, then our friend, the color selector, appears. And if I say I want purple wings, that's not really purple, is it? That's more of a purple. There we go. Then I can dial it in right there. And notice that as I do this, as I release the mouse, I get instant feedback. So if you don't know what you want in Max, you can fiddle around like this until you say, oh, yeah, it's got to be something like well, I was shooting for some sort of aluminum color when I made this kind of gray, but none of these really work for aluminum, and we'll get to that in a minute. But this is very nice in the fact that it's interactive and quick like that. Now, if you have to do actual color matching, then you can type in values here. Okay. Now notice that there are locks here, and that right now ambient, diffuse, and specular are locked in place. One thing I need to explain really quick is that the way that Max works is that materials and lighting are inextricably bound together. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but they're totally bound together. So what the material does is the material tells Max how to display a surface, either in the interactive viewport, which is this, in fact, is an interactive rendering that's happening right in front of our eyes, or if we are actually going to render, that in either case, that Max looks at the material and it takes its cues from the material on what to do based on certain lighting situations. Let's go ahead. I'm winging this, no pun intended. But I'm going to put a light in the scene, and I'm going to use a standard light. If you're working with V-Ray or if you're working with mental ray you want to use photometric lights, and with V-Ray you want to use V-Ray lights. I'm going to choose a target spot, and in the left view I'm going to make a spotlight like that. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go to, where will I find it? Lights and shadows, and say scene light control. For some reason, this is not showing me the lighting effect. Well, that's okay. We can look at it in the course of rendering. But so now that I have a light in the scene, then let's go ahead and hit render for a second and see what we get. First, I'll click on render setup really quick. I'll see I've got, I'll make 644/80 single frame, and let's just go ahead and hit render for a second. Okay, now you'll notice that the lighting is visible here. I'm going to be like a dog with a bone for a second, which I just want to see what have I chosen here that forces it to not. Scene light control. It may be the drivers that I'm using right now on this laptop are not allowing me to do that. Okay. Back to Material Editor. And Material Editor has ambient and diffuse locked together. If I change I'll unlock those and I'll put a different color into the ambient value there and say OK. And then I need to put some ambient light into the scene. So I'll go under the rendering panel, and ambient light is found in the environment under global lighting, and set this to, let's give it some ambient light. Say okay. Now notice what happens as soon as I'm starting to play with the ambient light. Look what's happening in the Material Editor. It's coming like that. And yes, somebody pointed out that instead of shaded, I should have realistic. And now once I have realistic, now brilliant, illuminate with scene lights, and there we have it in the view here. That's what happens when they keep changing the software on you. Everything you know goes away. There's a shelf life to our knowledge. It has to stay current. Okay, so now if I crank that ambient light up strong enough, now don't do this at home or anywhere else. Notice, however, that these areas that are outside, that are in the dark, are now demonstrating the ambient green color that I've put there. Now, you really don't want to set your ambient light to some gigantic value like this. So if I hit cancel, it'll go back to where I was, and if I hit black, it'll go back to where I was. But I just wanted to make this clear that why is this called ambient, why is this called diffuse, and why is this called specular? This is called specular because this is going to be the color that comes back at us when we have something that's shiny. I'm going to make that bright white for a second, and then I'm going to go shiny. Did someone say shiny? Yes, let's make it shiny. So down here we have specular highlights. And notice the specular level is set to 0. If I crank that up, you can see on the wing that it's starting to shine. Now the glossiness, if I make that narrow enough, this is probably not a good object to be doing this on, so I'm going to drag this on to that object as well. And I'm going to zoom in here. Let's hide the light display for a second. Go to display, turn off lights, and we'll also make this a little bit bigger so that we can see it nicely. So notice that now I've put this material on this section, which is called the sponson. And let's see what happens as we play with the glossiness. So now we have this very fine highlight here with the glossiness set like that. If we widen it out, this starts to get wider. We make it very, very wide like that. Looks like that. So this is how you can make your adjustments. So we have two things. Specular level is how much shininess is added to it, and the glossiness is actually sort of the shape and width of the highlight. And this is very simple and kind of primitive, but actually incredibly powerful. I'm trained in traditional art, and we spend so much of our time simply trying to mimic the real world. And this allows you to define how things are going to look. And look how dramatic this this looks. And so it goes. Okay, so this also shows you the relationship between specular, diffuse, and ambient, and shows you also the specular levels, glossiness. Soften is not something I ever really use. I'm not sure. I don't really see much of a difference happening, so I don't know what it's really doing, but I don't use it much. Okay. And before I forget, because I kind of just went over this really quickly, was that in the viewport, we're using Max 2012, and in 2013 they changed this, and in 2014 they will change it yet again. More and more and more is being pushed into the viewport. So right now, the things that we have in the viewport that are in 2012 that are pretty exciting is the ability to use the scene lights and then to show shadows and to show ambient occlusion in the viewport. If I turn ambient occlusion off, you'll see that the ambient occlusion is the dirt mapping that appears in here. Look in there and you can see what ambient occlusion is about. And under materials here, then it also has transparency, shaded materials without maps, shaded materials with maps, all this that lets you jump back and forth. I find a lot of times as I'm working, I want to be in shaded mode because I really don't want the scene lighting to get in the way of me being able to see what's going on in the viewport or what's going on with my model. Okay, back to the basics. One other real quick thing that I want to do here is actually put some sort of a plane, not a airplane, but a plane. I'm in the top view. I'll make a plane there, and then I will drag that plane down just so that you can see that we've got shadows that are happening in the viewport. If you're doing a design viz work, this is very cool because the shadows are very important. If you're doing, games, cutscenes, something like that, anything where you really need to know what the shadows are going to look like, it's a useful thing to know about. In this case, I might turn it off right now. Okay, so, and in fact, yeah, well, let's leave this the way it is for now, and we'll see how it develops. And my mouse has decided to fail me there. Here we go. Okay, so back to very simple materials. I'm going to take this material and put it over here. Whoops, got it on the wrong thing. Control Z. And that actually brings up how different ways to assign a material in the scene. So this material, you've seen me drag it onto an object. I can also select a particular object and then go over here and then say assign material to selection. That's a good way to do this. Yeah, this is a plane on a plane. Okay, so remember to name your materials, spawns, and very useful. Now, notice that this material here has little gray corners next to it, but this one has little white corners. The little white corners mean that it's on an object that's selected right now. So that we call that a hot material. This one, if I change that, I think we're still going to see it change in the viewport. So I'm not sure what the point is between a hot material and not, but it's good to see which materials are in use. Now, the thing that Max does, which is so confusing, is that I can take that material and drag it over here, and Max is happy to have lots of different things with the same name. So here I've got a material named P38 wing, which exists in the material editor only. Here I have a material named P38 wing, which exists both in the scene and in the material editor. If I change this one, it changes. If I change this one, it doesn't change in the viewport. Drive you crazy? It's a feature. You got to be really smart to use Max sometimes. Once you understand that that's what's going on, it's kind of cool. It means you can try on different materials here and get them as you like them without having to fiddle with it in the scene. But it's good to know that that's where it is, and that's how it works. And it'll make you less confused over what you're doing. Okay, so let's go back to this material and cover more basics about the material. In the shader basic parameters, we can make that material wireframe like that. And that wireframe material is very useful when you're doing modeling. Oftentimes I will put a wireframe material on something as I model, especially so it lets me see through the material to a plane on the back that might have a picture, a reference photo. And at the same time, this also will let me see the density of my mesh and what I'm building. If I do use wire material and I go to extended parameters, there's a wire section here. And I don't know if this is actually going to change anything in the viewport. I don't think it does. It only changes in the render. But if I zoom in here, you can see that I can make that wireframe thin, thick, or thicker, like that. And if I do actually render this for a second, let's render it, say render, you can see that the wireframe is showing up, and it's casting a nice wireframe shadow. One of the cheesiest tricks in the book is wireframe to shaded to show that it's actually CG. Now, when you can see through an object like this, like the wireframe, something is off, something is wrong. We are not seeing the inside of this. We have to turn this to two-sided. And as soon as we turn it to two-sided, render again, you have to look closely here, but then you can kind of see what it's doing there. So what is this about? There's something called face normals. So every surface, every plane, every piece of geometry, every triangle has a direction. I used to think of it like the hood of my car. The outside, the hood of my car gets this really nice fancy paint job. If I open it up, the inside is still got primer, it's still metal. So Max has to know which sides to paint. And if two-sided is off, any side that has the face normals pointing in the other direction, Max just throws those away. It doesn't show them. So if I render this now, that's the way it goes. Two-sided materials. I'm going to turn wire off for a second, and I'm going to demonstrate the next thing where you could make something see-through, which is opacity. If I take the opacity and I cut the opacity down, let's make the opacity much less, say 50% or a little less. Now I can see through those wings and I can see the shadow underneath. And once again, let's zoom in on this a little bit here. Actually, something that ought to have a material. going to have to show you that in a little bit here about how it's happening in here, that we have multiple colors here and how we'll use multiple materials. But for now, let's go ahead and say that this material has an opacity value. Let's make it even a lot lower than that. Actually, I'm going to put this, let's do a hold for a second so we can get back to this space. Hold. And now I'll take this and I'm going to put this on that object. So you can see how transparent it looks right now with opacity set at 20%. Let's increase it a little bit like that. And I'll set it to two-sided. And that's hit render again. F9 on the keyboard is a shortcut. And it's showing through like that. So that's opacity. Opacity is the same way as saying transparency. Now, there is advanced transparency. Just like in the extended parameters, the wire had an extra value here. Advanced transparency has the ability to do fall off. So if I choose fall off for this, I think it's probably easier not to worry about that, but just to look at this thing here. Let's add some advanced transparency to this. Why is it we can't see what it's going to do? Because there's no background. Now, if I choose a background here, now there's a background for me to look through and see. So if I increase this amount of transparency with a fall off, let's put this all the way to 100%. And I think the way this works is this can be set to 100. And now advanced transparency, if it's set to 100, you now see that there's fall off in the center, and that all of the faces here that are the face normals that are coming right out at you are getting 100% fall off. The face normals at the edges that are pointing 90 degrees away from us are getting solid color. Somebody's asking about backface culling. This is similar to backface culling. It's trying to decide which direction the faces are pointing in, and then based on that, it's putting some information here. Now, what's interesting is that you can also have the transparency type. So if I choose it to be subtractive or additive, we get a completely different effect here. No, do I know if class are written for UDK? That's not me. Okay, so in any case, this is if you want to make ghosts, if you want to make clouds, if you want to make contrails, there's a lot of uses to know about this additive versus subtractive. I've rarely found a practical application for it, and maybe I just haven't hit it. And then if you have filter, you can actually add a filter color. So let's put that strong enough so you can see that that filter color is being applied into the center here. Generally speaking, these are fairly primitive kinds of effects that are not highly sophisticated and that aren't really used much in serious work, except in fields where they're not so visually sophisticated. Medical visualization, scientific visualization, oftentimes is non-realistic and doesn't really want to mimic reality. And in those cases, these things are completely applicable. We will continue with this right now. Index of refraction I haven't used. I want to go back for 1 second to the wireframe because I didn't explain one thing which is very interesting about the wireframe, which is that if you choose pixels, then the wireframe, you can decide how fat the pixels, how many pixels wide that wire is going to be. I'm going to put that down to back 0 like that. If I choose units, then as you see through the object, the The ones in front will be thicker than the ones in the back. I used to use this a lot, but it has some quirks to it. If you use mapping, it becomes kind of useless. But with a simple color on it, it can be interesting and effective. And it will honor which edges of your object are chosen as visible. So you can actually use it, you can control it fairly nicely. Okay, so now we've covered a good deal of the very basic information about materials. Now I want to extend to a couple other parts of this. I'm going to skip super sampling for now, and I'm going to talk about mapping. Maps are texture maps, or that's what I like to call them. Mapping is a way that you can use pictures or procedurally generated textures to make more interest on your geometry. And as an artist, this is driving me a little crazy, so I'm just going to come back here to where the lights are, and so I can see my light and go to my light here and go to the modify panel and take the spotlight parameters and increase the fall off, so I'm not seeing something so ugly. There we go. Okay. So the simplest type of mapping, okay, is the diffuse channel. So just like the diffuse color is really the bulk of what we're seeing here, the diffuse channel color is where you can put a map into place, and then that map will be applied to the object. Now, how that map is applied to the object is done through something called UVW mapping. Let's start by going to apply a map. There's two ways to apply the map. Let me come up over here to let me close this up for 1 second here just to show you that there's a little button right next to the diffuse here, and if you put your mouse over it, it says none. If you click there, that takes you right here to the material map browser. In the material map browser, I can open up the maps, and now these are all the different map types that are available to me. Once again, based on the particular renderer that I've selected. If I have V-Ray, if I have Mental Ray selected, I get a completely different list here. I'm going to choose bitmap. Bitmap is the only one of these that is not procedural, and I will say OK. And now it takes me to select bitmap image dialog box, and this now lets me pick maps based on wherever it thinks I should be looking. Now I am going to go ahead and let's see. Right now it's looking in images under documents and settings, and that's not really a good place to be looking. So I will show you where most likely in a default installation you will find maps. And that is to go all the way up to the drive where you have installed Macs, the C drive in my case, and then I go to Program Files, and then inside Program Files, Autodesk. And now, let's see, which are we on? We're in 3ds Max 2012 and under Maps. Now, in most recent years, they've stopped installing a huge amount of maps here. So if I go all the way back to Max 9, Maps, now I have this giant collection of maps that I can use. Now, just for the sake of being perverse, I'm going to use something that you would never put on the wings of a plane. What will I use today? Will I use bricks? Okay, we'll use some bricks, and here I can set this to thumbnails, and I can see the bricks that I've got chosen. I'm going to pick a Let's choose yellow brick, say OK. So now if we look at this, we don't see any yellow brick here. What has happened? What has gone wrong? Well, in Max's infinite knowledge, infinite wisdom, there's some things that need to be done here so that this can be seen. So we know that this is placed on here. There's a little button that says Show Shaded Material in Viewport. And as soon as I click on that, now this is starting to show the material as it were. If I zoom in on this, you can see it appears to be some kind of brick, but it's really stretched out of place. What I need to do is to assign this a UV map. I'm going to choose UV map. And now I have, if I open up the gizmo for the UV map, I find it's infinitely small. There's no gizmo to speak of. And that's because there's two settings that I need to turn off. Over here it says real world map size. If I turn that off, and then over here, real world scale, I turn that off. And now I have, let's zoom in on this, something that is starting to make sense now a little bit. Now, the one thing I can now start to do is to adjust this in a number of ways. The gizmo is visible here, and the gizmo has been made to fit the geometry. Now, if I change this and say I want to do bitmap fit, and I pick yellow brick and say open, then the bitmap gizmo proportions will match the proportions of the actual bitmap. Let's look at the bitmap by coming to the bitmap parameters and choose view image, and we can see what these bricks appear to look like, and then we look here and they appear relatively the same. So that's the brute force way to do this. Now, if you're doing design visualization and you need these bricks to really be, you go, well, that's nice. They look kind of the right proportion, but except those are like 4-foot long bricks. There's no such thing. So I want those to be a real world scale. And that's why you use real world scale there and then put real world scale on it here. And then you can make it work that way. But what you can do here, if you're working in the entertainment world, is that you can go and choose uniform scale, and I can proceed to, let's scale in a particular direction, the gizmo. Let's start by moving the gizmo. Notice if I move the gizmo, I can place it like that. If I want to scale the gizmo, I can do that. As an artist, I like this because I can get it so that just the way I want it. If I use rotate, I can rotate this. I want it to go long ways. And so forth. And of course, Max is so cool because everything can be animated. So you can turn auto key on, go to frame 100. I will rotate this around. And now I hit the play button in the viewport. Where is it? So I can get clouds animating in the sky. I can make waterfalls by animating a gradient over a geometry. I can make waves by animating a bump map over a plane. There's all sorts of interesting things you can do in this sort of texturing by animating the gizmo. Okay. Let's go back to M on the keyboard. And I may not have mentioned that, but M on the keyboard is the shortcut for the material editor. Now, there's a lot to talk about here. There are different ways that we can make this work. So I think this will actually be interesting to see if I if I can do this, maybe not, is that I can control the material both at the UVW map level and also at the coordinate level here. So I can adjust the offset here. Let's try the V offset, or the tiling, 6, enter, and that's affecting it right there. However, if I change the tiling over here, let's see, V tiling 2, what I want you to notice is that this fuselage here is not changing. That this lets me control the texture on an individual object because of the UV map that's been placed on it. This lets me control, let's go back to 1 here, and if I change that tiling here, it will affect every instance of the material in the scene. So that's important to understand that those are different. Okay. Now, if we go to the bitmap parameters rollout here, just very quickly, I also want to explain that if I click on View Image, I can see the image here, and I can also see certain things about it. I can make changes to it here. In addition to that, here where I pick the bitmap, I can get, this is important, this is where I learn about the statistics. What is the resolution of that particular bitmap? If I go to Info, it can give me some information about it. If I go to View, it takes me to that same dialog here. And I think, where is it? There's an eyedropper hiding in here. I don't remember where it is. Right click, copy, right click, paste. No, I'll have to dig around for it. That lets you actually help in color matching so that you can actually go and color match off of some other object. Okay, so enough of that. That's your basic kind of mapping. And if we go to, this is very important, that to navigate around this map, this material, there is a button here that says Material Map Navigator. And the Material Map Navigator is an old technique, but still a good one, that will let me jump around. So here I'm at the map level, here I'm at the top level. If I'm at the map, I can also get back by go back to parent like that. Okay. Now, what happens if we show you some other kinds of mapping? Let's turn this off for a minute, and let's turn this off for a second so we don't have any mapping there. And now let's choose a bump mapping. Now, bitmap again. Do I have any bump maps? I'm going to go ahead and use the yellow brick map as my bump map. Now, you won't see the bump mapping in the viewport. Let's see what happens if we hit render right now. You can barely see the bump mapping because we have to turn off real world scale on it. Render it again. Let's zoom in on this. And let's increase the amount of bump mapping. It's set to 30%. Let's set it to 300. That's not percent, it's just a value. And now I will hit, I have to click someplace to get off of that for a second, F9, render it. There we go. Bump mapping is your friend. Bump mapping is what makes this so cool. And in fact, something that I call Gerhard's principle is that all beauty comes from bump plus shine plus reflection. So you make things in water that's shiny and disturbed, bumpy, and it reflects, you have instant beauty. Simple, cheap, Party tricks. Now, if we turn the diffuse map on and we render now, the bump mapping is not actually matching. You want to line them up so they're just exactly using the same, and then you'll get something that'll look even better. So what did we have to do to change that? Let's see. This is set to real world scale. Make these the same. Well, here's what we can do. We'll drag that one down to here and we'll instance it. Remember what an instance is? Now when we render together, bingo, got it. When the bump and the texture coincide, then we're in business. Now we could also, I'm winging it here again. Let's see what happens if I put this into the specular and the shininess. Let's see if this makes it any different. Now we've made it become less interesting. Now, how do we get rid of these? You drag the word none back onto these, and that's how that's done. I think this might be a good time to take a quick break. Nelson?
Alrighty.
Let's stop it we'll give it a 10-minute break, and then we'll come back, and then we're going to deal with much more about kinds of mapping as well as unwrap.
All right.
Okay. And we're back. Okay. I wanted to show you some other things, some other quick material tricks. So I'm going to do this. I think it's easier to see this on a scene like this. So let me put this together really fast. We'll make a material here. We'll call this material teapot. And we'll make another material, we'll give it a slightly different color. And we'll put it on that plane. And we will call it box. So we have two materials there. And let's put a light in the scene. And again, a standard light, target spotlight, around from there. And just make sure that this is set to illuminate scene materials, scene lights. We'll bounce back and forth between this as we need. Oops. Okay. So M on the keyboard. Let's put a kind of mapping on this, diffuse mapping, bitmap. This time I'm going to choose some wood, and look at this in thumbnails. Fence. Is it fence that I want? Yeah, fence. Open that up and display it. Make sure non-real world scale is on that one, and the real world scale is off of that one, and we have our fence posts looking like that. What I wanted to show you was that primitive objects generate their own mapping coordinates. So you don't have to actually add mapping coordinates to primitive objects. They can generate their own. If you put a UVW map on it, then that overrides it so that you can use that. So let's show you that now I would like to add reflection mapping to this. Reflection mapping can be found in the Maps channel under Reflection. And in this case, I would like to have the object in the scene be reflected. Let's make something that's very obvious in color. I'll just use that pink teapot. I'll make it a little shiny, and that should do it. And now let's go back to this, and we will add reflection mapping. So instead of choosing a bitmap, I want this to reflect the objects in the scene. So I'm going to either use a reflect, refract, or a ray trace. I'll try a ray trace now and see how that goes. And the ray trace parameters here give me some basic choices. I won't see it in the viewport if I hit F9 on the keyboard. Let's see what we get. Okay, let's do one thing, which is to take that lighting and let's open it up so that it extends out like that. And now F9 on the keyboard again. There we go. We now have the reflection of the teapot in the wood. Now that teapot is not quite resting on the object. If it comes down a little bit, maybe we'll get a better result here. Or maybe not. Maybe there's a fall off somewhere on that. Let's also go ahead and add some bump mapping to that. I will drag that fence down here and we'll say instance. And I'm going to crank it up so that it's obvious. There we go. And you can start to see the bump changing in there. Other kinds of mapping, opacity mapping. Opacity mapping takes care of a transparency. In this case, to make it sort of obvious what's going on, I'm going to choose a checker. And the checker parameters, let's see if I can actually see the checker. I did. I put it in the wrong thing. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to, I want to put the checker on that, on the teapot. Go to maps, opacity mapping, and checker. Say OK. Let's display it. Let's turn. Let's see what happens if I hit render. Not much is happening here, I think, because of the size of the opacity. Let's turn off real world scale on both of these. There we go. Now we can see the size of it. Let's render it again. There we go. We have some nice opacity mapping going on. Hang on, let's zoom in on this. Render it so you can see what's going on. Simple party tricks, but look how realistic and how interesting looking we're starting to get there. Bump plus reflection equals beauty. Anytime you make something transparent, you have to think about the two-sidedness. Set it to two-sided, render again. Now it looks more realistic, slightly more realistic, in a surreal way. Okay. One other very simple thing I didn't mention, which is actually incredibly useful and used a lot, is self-illumination. Now, self-illumination is a complete misnomer to me. Self-illumination, when I hear that word, I think, oh, the object is giving off light. Self-illuminated, it illuminates itself, but that's not what it is. If I turn on self-illumination here, let's render this again. We're starting to see something happen. Let's put it 100% self-illuminated, and let's turn off the opacity for a minute and render again. And what you start to see is what self-illumination means is simply that the ambient values will never be darker than the values of the diffuse. But there's another consequence to self-illumination mapping, and that is if I turn the specular value off and I render it again, self-illumination in essence flattens 3D objects into 2D in your rendering. And that's what it's used for primarily. So generally speaking, it becomes a kind of a compositing trick that you use self-illumination to flatten out areas and then you slap a texture on it. So you're painting onto it what you want to achieve rather than having the 3D take care of it. I don't know if that makes sense or not. But that's one of the ways it's used. Now, if you use V-Ray or if you use Mental Ray or other sophisticated renderers, self-illumination can actually mean that it renders, that it illuminates. So that's something that we could look at some point. Okay, so I think what I'm going to do at this point, instead of going into more kinds of materials, there's a lot of kinds of materials that I could show you here, and there's tons of interesting stuff. But I want to show you something practical, and hopefully I'll be able to get it right, and that is called unwrap. So let's go back to this guy, and when you have an object like this, one of the things that you want to do is the ability to paint a texture on an object. And so we use something called the unwrap modifier to put a texture on an object and then paint that texture. And there are many tools to do that with, but this is the original method, and I'd like to show this to you if I can get it to work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add, let's make this large so we can see it. I've added, instead of adding a UV map, I'm adding an unwrap UV. And unwrap UV, I come over here and I can pick faces that I would like to unwrap. If I drag like this, I'm selecting all those faces. And there's a button here that is under Edit UVs.
And we're back. Sorry about that. We had slight technical difficulties. However, everything is now going smoothly. So,
okay, we are back. All right, so I'm going to fetch this, and we're going to come back to this in a second. About to fetch, yes. Yes. Come back. Say okay. All right, so I want to isolate this object here and come back here and just demonstrate that M on the keyboard, that we can take multiple materials and we can add them to one object in a number of different ways. I'm going to change this from an editable poly to an editable mesh. An editable mesh is an earlier technology, but the one thing that editable mesh should allow me to do is to drag and drop materials onto selection sets of faces. So if I take a material and I will call it cockpit skin, and I will give it some classy orange color here, and I select some faces and I drag it onto there, and then I come like that. Those faces have now received that material. I'll go ahead and choose a few more faces here, like that, and drag it onto there. And then you can see they've received that material. Now, if I'll select a different material here, and I will call this blue glass. And I will select some other faces and drag them onto that. And now this appears, for all intents and purposes, to have this material cockpit skin and this material blue glass on this object, but that's not really true. If I go over here and I then choose the eyedropper and I select on this material, on this object, and get the material, I discover that this has something called material number 69, which I will call multi-material for P38 plane. And you'll discover that it has a material ID 1, a material ID 2, material ID 3, 4, and 5 that have all been created for this one object. And that if I go to the section that is for material ID, and I take that and I change its material ID to be material ID 1, enter, that becomes that material. If I choose all of these and make them all material ID 1, then we've created it in that way. I can also find everything that's material ID 5 and select it, and then make it material ID 1, enter, and that's another way to deal with it. I can select that, which is ID 4, make it ID 2, enter, and that's how it's accomplished. Now, I don't know if this has gotten fixed because I haven't checked it in a long time, but Edit Poly in previous versions did not allow you to drag and drop materials onto it. Instead, what you had to do was to select the faces and basically do this in a more, a way where you say, okay, this is going to be material ID 3. And all of these guys are going to be material ID 4. And then build the material and then put it on the object. So that's something you should know about. Okay, what else? Other kinds of materials that are really pretty useful for you to use, blend materials. Excuse me. I'm going to put a material on this. It's a gray material, and we will give it a texture. Oh, let's see. Hold on a second here. Just choose something crazy and display it. Oh, put it on there. There it is. We're displaying that. And actually looks a little bit like camouflage. So that's a single material that's been applied. But then we can go and we can say, no, I don't want it to be a standard material. Instead, I would like it to be a blend material. Choose blend and keep the old material as a submaterial. Did I pick the wrong button there? Control Z. Hold on a second. There it is. And blend material. Keep old material as submaterial. Oh, I just haven't named it. That's all, I think. Okay, default here. Yes, this one has the map. Come over here. Go to the map level. Go like that. And I'm not seeing the map. All right. Well, we'll go up to the second one. This is why you name your materials. Other one. And that one, we'll give it something else. Let's give it another bitmap. Something completely different. Let's choose a sky. Like that. And now, if we get up here, we have a blend material. Now, if we render this, we don't see the second material at all because one is on top of the other one, but there's no mask and there's no mix amount. Now, if I set the mix amount to be 100% and I render it, I'm getting that sky, but the sky is not working very well yet because if I go to that, I need to turn off use real world scale. And I probably also need to make sure I got some UVW map on it, which has real world scale off. Let's try it again. No, what am I doing wrong? Not sure. Okay, so let's go back to that blend material. And instead of using just a mix amount, let's use a mask. Let's just see if we're back where we were. Okay, we're back there. Then for a mask, I'm just going to use a checker pattern. and turn off real world scale and set the tiling to something. Let's render that. There we go. Okay, so you can see that you can mix, you can blend in that way. If I turn that off and I set this to be 50%, render it. There we go. Now we're starting to get something that's appealing. Now, you used to be able to actually see one or the other, depending on what you do. But I don't know why I'm not seeing that. Okay, so anyway, that is a blend material. And similar to the blend material, you can also do blends at the map level. So if I have a standard material, let's put a standard material on that object, and let's give it a color so we know we have that on the object. Now we go, and instead of choosing bitmap, we'll choose a mix. And say OK. And the mix lets you have different maps here. So I'll have a checker. And actually, let's do something that's different instead of a checker. Let's just do 2 bitmaps so we can see if we can make that work. Let's try that. Let's try this cloud. And let's change its size. Let's make the tiling 3 by 3. Okay, there we can obviously see that. Come over here and now mix that with a second bitmap. And there's the second one. Again, we'll set the mix map 50%. And render, see what we get. So you can use a mix map as well. You can also use a curve, and you can actually just sort of create your own values for the curve. Render that. Okay, mix and blend, extremely useful tools. One other tool that I really like, although there's so many different kinds of maps here that to go into, it's kind of difficult to decide what else to give you as a good trick to use or good things to use. So I think I'll show you a few more things that I use a lot. In the same way that we're doing blends, there is a composite material and a composite map. And there's a color correction map that works well. So let's demonstrate that one. So here, I'll make one more standard material. And then instead of using a mix map, I'll use a color correction map. And the color correction map, actually, I want to put that on top of the, I want to use the composite, not the color correct. So we're going to go to the composite map type. Discard old map. Okay, so in this composite, this looks a lot like Photoshop. Now, if we come over here, we can put the map that we want inside of here. Okay, so there we have it. Turn off real world scale. Let's set the tiling again, 3 by 3. Let's see if we turn it on, we can see it there. Okay, let's go up a directory, up a level. Now let's go and add a new layer. And in this one, we will add a different texture. Bitmap. And that one. Now, at that layer, we can see it, and we can come back down here, and we can decide what we want to do. We can change the opacity of that layer. Let's make that 24. Enter. And if we render, we will see it. We won't see it otherwise. Notice that the render only works when the, okay, not showing it well enough there. So we'll make that maybe 75 and F9. Okay, that's looking a little bit more. What else can we do here? The other things that are really interesting is that we can have a color correct. We can color correct this guy. So we can say, oh, let's shift this, and I'll just do something really violent to show the color correct here. So that's a hue shift. We can change the brightness, change the contrast. At TurboSquid, we hate people who do this. And that's just because color correct is just, it's not WYSIWYG. It's not, you don't see what you get. I love it. I think it's great technology personally, because I used to do all this in Photoshop, and it was just a really nice addition. Now there's actually this advanced one, and don't ever tell anybody I told you to do this. You could actually do your gamma correction in here. Please don't. These are things that as soon as you take these models and you try sending them out to another program, they really get nasty. But I happen to really like color correct a lot because it's so interactive. And I think that if I go and I do it right here, I can actually see my adjustments, turn the saturation down, do whatever I want right like that. When I'm doing this kind of work, I can add as many layers as I want. I can also color correct the masks. What else? I can duplicate the layer. And I have never tried this, but I suppose I can animate these values as well. So that's the composite map type. There's also a composite material type. Which allows you to put as many different materials as you want like that. Okay. I think that that's going to be it for today. Hold on.
Alrighty.
So, anybody have any? We can turn the recording off, or do you want to record the questions?
Sure. If there's any questions that
are there any questions?
Well, it looks like
okay.
there was.
You know what? Actually, I didn't show was just. I mean, this doesn't have to be recorded, but I hit the wrong one. Okay, so let's just go and find this. I just wanted to show, and you guys have probably already seen this kind of thing, but here's an example of I wanted to just show what the kind of maps would look like. So this is a file that comes with Max 2012, and it's the file that you use to teach yourself to do the unwrap. And then if we look at some of these, this is an example of an unwrapped texture for the head. This is using a different kind of technique, which is called pelt. And in that you select the faces and then you click pelt and it unfolds it and then you paint on top of it. There's a, let's go to the next material. Actually, let's go up here and up one more. And you see this is a multi-material. Here's the body. View the body. Here's an example of the body. Again, painted stuff. And one more. Here's the hair. I don't know what the hair material is going to look like. Open it up. The view image. There's a painting of the hair. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you so you could see what a real thing looked like. All right, that's it for today.
Alrighty. So, thank you very much, and let's go ahead and stop the recording.
All right.